What's going on, everybody? Here we are on a Monday, and Monday is the day where we talk about your responses to my question from the previous week. Now, last week, I asked a question that I think is super important. I mean, personally, I think it really, really matters. And that is, what is the state of comps? Does comping matter anymore? Is comping with all of the, I mean, there are all of these apps now, and there are all these websites where we can see what cards recently sold for, like up to the second. And for a long time, we've been relying on it, but should we be relying on it? And all of this started because I'm in this group chat, and my good friend Dylan, Double D Vintage Baseball Cards, he just said, comping is over. That has passed. And I was like, that you might be onto something. That there is actually a lot of truth to that. And then John Mangini jumped in. He goes, yeah, there really is. And I think that it's a complicated topic. And I think that you all had some really good responses. And I, as always, have some thoughts on that. So I look forward to looking at several of your responses and then sharing my response to your feedback. Now, the other thing I got to throw out there is I have about 40 copies left of my Captain Midlife card. If you are interested in picking one of these up, courtesy of our friends at the Penny Sleever. And when you do, if you fill out the form that is down below in the description, you'll also get a Mr. Penny Sleever card with the promo card Midlife on the back that will get you 10% off. Really excited about that. Again, I have about 40 or so left. Courtesy of the Penny Sleever, there are 250 free of charge. All you have to do is fill out the form and request one. Give me your information so I can mail it to your house. Very excited for that. And I think that you'll be impressed with the quality of the semi-rigid and the top loaders and the sleeves that the cards will come in from the Penny Sleever. Now, I also got a couple of really, really cool gifts this past week, and I want to show those with you. The first one is from my buddy Jason. Now, he sent me, you guys know that there are 3 players that I player collect. Roger Clemens, Greg Nettles, and Matt Manning, my former student who is in the system for the Tigers, at least at the moment. And he sent me a bunch of minor league cards of Matt Manning, and I didn't have any of them. So let me show you a few of these. This is the Connecticut Tigers from 2017. That is an awesome card. You got Top Prospects, the New York Penn League. That is, these are so cool. I was so excited when these came. I was opening them and I was like, oh my gosh, these are amazing. My wife's like, what are you opening? I go, I got these Manning cards. They're minor league cards. 2018 West Michigan Whitecaps. We've got a Midwest League Top Prospects Whitecaps card. An Erie Seawolves. A Western Division All-Star Game. And then he threw in a Joe Montana card. Love it. So that was awesome. Thank you, my friend. I already reached out to you on Instagram and thanked you, but I did want to show those. And then my good friend Brent from Brent Richards and Baseball Cards, he has a bunch of photos that he collected over the years. Of just going to baseball games and different events and stuff. And he's been slowly but surely turning some of them into cards and then putting them in Brent Richards slabs. So he sent me this Roger Clemens. He took that picture. Look at that suit. Man, that is awesome. And he numbered it 2 out of 2. He has the other one. So he has 1 out of 2. I have 2 out of 2. Look at that. That is so cool. Appreciate that, my friend. And then this other 2 out of 2 It's a picture he took of Jeter and Jason Giambi. Very cool. So appreciate those. That was very cool. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of your responses. But before we get too far into it, some of us think that it's a very simple question, and some of us think it's a very complicated question. So I wanted to share two very different responses because I think that they kind of illustrate just how different some of us feel about the topic of comps. So look at these.
Comping vintage cards is easy. Grading company, grade, and centering. And my dad says, as you said, comping new cards is pretty simple. Read the grade, look it up, and that's the value. Quality control in the vintage years was really a crapshoot. To say two vintage cards are the same is very much a different story. Printing flaws, centering, card size cutting, and on and on and on. Good luck even comparing two vintage cards. It really seems vintage cards are in the eye of the beholder, which makes it back to buy it if you like the looks of it.
So how different could those have been? I mean, you got one that's saying, yeah, of course we can comp. Of course. You look at the card, you look at the grade, you look at the grading company, you look at the centering, it tells you the value. And then you got the one from my dad, which says, with modern cards, where the cards are all pretty much coming out of the packs very, very similarly. I mean, you lay out 10 on a table, and with modern cards, most of them come out of the packs looking close to identical. But then with vintage cards, it's all over the place. Largely because of the quality of the printing, the quality of the materials, the paper that was used. And I kind of think that it is a more complicated topic than it might seem. On the face value, you might say, it's just, the 7's a 7. That one's a little bit better centered, so maybe it's worth a little bit more. I think it's kind of a complicated topic. I think that there's a lot to it. So let's take a look here at some of your responses kind of grouped together by some similarities. Let's look at the first category here.
Now this category says, yes, you can comp vintage cards, but comps can only provide a ballpark value. Of course you can comp vintage cards, just like houses are not all exactly alike. They are comped every day. It's a starting point from which to begin applying pluses and minuses. House A and House B are in the same zip code and have similar square footage. Average sale prices of C to Z in those bounding conditions is X. You have a starting point. But House A has a brand new roof and House B's is 28 years old. House B has a nicely remodeled kitchen, but House A's has a 50-year-old avocado green or harvest gold appliances that were all the rage in the mid-70s. These are all pluses and minuses to apply to that starting point until an agreeable price is established, or not. Sports cards and most all collectibles, for that matter, work on similar principles. Yes, every situation can be nuanced, but to think it can't really be done because no two vintage cards are exactly alike is conflating comparable with identical. This next comment says, for me, with comping vintage cards, I generally use grades as zip code, then use things like centering, color, and general eye appeal as a differentiator. So if it's a PSA 3, checking all the boxes, I'll lean more towards a 4 comp. Whereas if it checks none, I lean towards a 2. Great video, Greg. The memories associated with the cards are what make them special. The amazing friendships we get from the hobby is priceless. I would answer your question this way. I use a combination of VCP and card ladder to find a ballpark comp. I have to take into account the slab, and if it is a recent slab or an old one, the eye appeal definitely means something too. Sometimes a 3 looks more like a 4 and can comp as a 4. So it is definitely a case-by-case basis. I have also spent higher than comps on some cards that were amazing cards and didn't really fall inside traditional comps, like my Crackerjack Joe Jackson. I paid the most ever at the time for an authentic altered version of that card, but to me, it was worth it. I would rather have that card at that price than a PSA 1 at the same price that looked like a rat chewed some holes in it.
Now, some of us would say, of course it's just a ballpark. Yes, it's a ballpark. The grade gives us a guide to approximately the condition, and then based on the condition within the grade, but we have to understand this is progress. This is a lot of progress. There was a time when grading first kicked in. For several years, it was sort of like an 8 was an 8 was an 8. The PSA had an SMR, and the SMR was based on the grades. And the SMR was higher than Beckett, that's for sure. And what they did was they used recent sales, sort of like we have now, but it was delayed. It'd come out like once a month. And that was sort of the guide, because we come from this situation where one of the beauties of what Dr. Beckett did with his monthly price guide was he put uniformity into the hobby. And by putting that uniformity into it, and even said it in the conversations when we talked with him, when I've gotten to talk with him a couple of times. I was on his podcast once. He came on my channel with Darren once. And what he said was, a lot of the dealers were like, you're going to put us out of business. Everyone's going to now know what the cards are worth. And the reason that we did well before is because nobody knew what they were worth. So that uniformity, it really protected the collector. And one of the best things of the Beckett Monthly Price Guide was protecting the collector. But then what it did is it made us a little bit reliant on price guides. It made us rely on those because whatever that said was the value. And then when we had all of a sudden grades, and there's a 9 and a 10 and an 8 and a 4 and a 5, it was no longer the Beckett that we could go to know the price. And then the prices kind of became ambiguous. And then the SMR that PSA put out, that would give you the idea grade by grade, instead of just, this is a nice one, this is a little bit of a beat up one, like the Beckett had, the high and the low column. And so we went through this period in the 80s and the 90s where whatever the price guide said, whether it be the Beckett or the SMR, that's the price. And some dealers, the savvy dealers, would see, well, this is a really nice 8 and it's better than your average 8, and they would pay up for it. And they would get the nicest stuff, and you'd look in their cases and you're like, man, all of your 8s look good. Now, were some of them cracking and resubmitting? Probably. They probably were doing that. But again, saying that a comp is a ballpark, that is a somewhat recent phenomenon. And I know there are going to be people out there going, that's not recent. I've been doing that for years. I've been buying the nice ones for over whatever the comps, the Beckett, the SMR, the going rate was for years. No, savvy people were doing that, but a lot of people weren't. A lot of us, it was whatever the price guide said. So acknowledging that there is an improvement in that, and we look at the grading, and we look at the grade and we go, well, this is a really nice 7, maybe an undergraded 7, and this is maybe an overgraded 7. And sort of like what Tony said, this might be a grade from 20 years ago versus this one, which just happened, and they're using technologies now that they weren't using then, making a 7 now a tougher 7 than it was 20 years ago. I don't think that maybe we realize the fact that we're acknowledging that it's a guide and it's a guide. If it says a 7, people might be willing to pay an 8 price. Or if it's a 7 that's not that nice looking, it might only be worth a 6 price. What that's actually doing, it's a really big deal. And it's really important because what it's doing is it's taking the power back from the grading companies and back from the price guides and into the hands of the collectors. And what collectors are now doing is they're buying cards that they like the looks of instead of just the ones that technically grade at a certain level. Now, there are a lot of people that still rely heavily on the grade of the grading companies. And I do understand that because in most cases, if a card gets a 7 and you thought it was going to be an 8, there are some underlying issues that make it the 7 instead of the 8. But to me, as a collector, I'm more interested of, do I like how it looks? And if I like how it looks, I'm good. And so what a lot of savvy collectors, I think, are doing now is they're saying, if I can buy an undergraded 7, if I could buy a 7 that to my naked eye looks like an 8, and I could pay average 7 prices, then I'm getting a card that's really nice. A card that could maybe get an 8. Maybe should have gotten an 8. But if it got the 7, it's for something that most of us can't identify with the naked eye for the price of a 7. So if you see a really high eye appeal example of a card in a grade and the asking price is the price comparable with that grade, that's usually a pretty good deal. I pay over comp all the time. I paid high comp the other day on my 53 Bowman Warren Spahn. I paid high comp on my T206 Walter Johnson that I bought at the National. Sometimes it's a ballpark, but calling it a ballpark, calling it a zip code instead of this is the grade, so this is the price, is a huge power grab back from the collecting community. It's a really good thing. Let's look at what some of the other responses had to say.
So another common thought is, no, comps don't really matter. This first one from the one and only Mr. Mike Petty is comps schmomps. It is a general guideline and nice to know. That's about where it ends for me these days. On low eye appeal, it may work, but on items I've been trying to buy lately, it makes zero difference. When I looked and cared more, I won less. Probably a good thing when I spent into the falling knife this year. Most of it I won was second-hand low eye appeal, but I got a good price. If you want nice things, you're going to have to pay the piper. Comps be damned. I'm happy I've hit the wall with my collection. The remaining cards are big and will take me the rest of my life to obtain it all. Comps ain't gonna be at the forefront of that for me anyway. And then also, Eddie's Cardboard Chaos says, Greg, great question for this week. I don't think there is a reliable way to comp ungraded vintage cards, particularly on eBay or through other online vendors, because you really need to put your eyes on the vintage card. With graded, I think it's a little more realistic to comp from the completed sales and use that as a base. I have a nice 58 Topps Ernie Banks PSA 3 that easily could have been a 4 or better. I paid more than what a 3 comps for because it was nicer than a 3. The grade allowed the dealer and I ground on which to stand so we could negotiate. We may not have been able to find common ground without a starting point.
Now, whenever Petty has a comment, it's always tremendous. And in this particular comment, that is certainly the case. You know, and he makes a great point, and it's very, very true. When we're talking about high-end stuff, that looks nice. If you're talking about a high-end cool card that looks nice, a lot of us go, man, all the stuff that I'm looking at, all the stuff that I want, it's selling for a lot. It's not come down in price like so many of the other cards. Well, is it that they're all selling for a lot? Or is it just that the ones that you like are selling for a lot? Because what a lot of the times we go, oh, great, the card that I want in a 4 finally hit the market, and this one's gorgeous. This is a gorgeous example of a 4. I'm going to bid what the last 3 have sold for, even though the last 3 were kind of dogs. And then we say, why didn't I get it? Well, the reason you're not getting it, I think, is because you're trying to use the comp based on the grade. But what we're all have been saying for a while now is the grade is just a guide. It's a zip code. It's a ballpark. So if there's a card that you like the looks of, and it's like, oh, I've been wanting one in about a 5 grade that looks nice, and this one looks really, really nice. Guess what? You're going to have to pay up for it. Because just like what Petty said, when they go to the auctions and it's a really nice looking card, you're not the only one who thinks it looks really nice. That's why the really nice examples at the average comp price is a steal. Because the really good ones are selling for more than the comp. And what that means is the comp is kind of out the window. The comp is kind of out the window when you start talking about things like a really nice looking vintage card. A really nice looking vintage card for the grade, you can't use the grade as what you expect it to go for. You have to use what maybe does the card look like it should have graded. Because as long as one other person is doing that, you're not going to win. So I think what he's saying here is your auction, it's going to go for over comp if it's a really nice looking card with high eye appeal. And to the second point from Eddie, totally agree about the cards that are raw. Raw cards, especially on online platforms, are brutally tough. People don't want to roll the dice. How do you comp that? You go, oh, well, based on this picture, which may or may not be altered, I think that looks like it could get a 4. So I'll buy it at 4 prices, and then you get it in the mail, and that picture, which may have kind of hidden some of the issues with the card. So a comp on an ungraded card on an online platform is literally, it's literally like taking a spin on the roulette wheel. You could get an absolute screamer and you could get an absolute dog. But I do understand if you see a card that is a high-end card with high-end eye appeal, if you don't step up and pay over what that average comp is, you're probably not getting it. And that's basically been the experience of our friend Mr. Petty this year, according to him. Although I've seen some of his stuff and he's got some pretty good stuff.
Another category is it's tough to comp a rare card. This one says, in terms of comping a vintage card, I think the smart buyer starts with a price in mind. For example, I'm going to pay $1,000 for a 48-leaf Bednarik. I know that going in. Now, the quest is to find the very best copy of that card for around $1,000. Rather than compare or comp, start with the end in mind as a buyer. And the buyer now holds more power and direction in the transaction. It's so difficult to comp because there aren't a lot out there. Andrew says, interesting question. From my card show experiences, some of the dealers do not care about what a vintage card is being valued, whether it's a VCP price or an eBay price. And I believe this is probably because they, the dealer, want the most money they can get to make a profit from the card, or they bought high on the card and are refusing to sell low and take a loss. So is it possible to comp a vintage card? Yes, it is. In my opinion, probably 99% of the time, unless it's like maybe the vintage cards which rarely show up throughout the year, and maybe the super high-end cards that tend to sell for six figures in an auction house. To your other question, if comps are a waste of time, or I guess if buyers and sellers should follow the comps, or the data, which shows the current market value, I would think that it would be helpful. But I said some dealers do not care or want to know. They are underwater. I kind of miss the days of the Beckett magazine price guide. We won't go back to those days. We could, and maybe we should, but we won't. It is what it is.
Okay, now these comments are important to keep in mind. When it comes to a rare card, 100% the comps go out the window. They are completely out the window. Now, a rare card might be a card with a population of 3, or it might be a perfectly centered Ozzie Smith rookie card. A perfectly centered Ozzie Smith rookie card in a 6, in my opinion, could arguably sell for an 8 price of one that's fairly off center. So rare card being they don't come up very often, like my Blackbeard pirate card, or a card that's just hard to come by, like that perfectly centered Ozzie Smith. Now, when those come up, because they are so few and far between, the comps are irrelevant. And the reason they're irrelevant is because there may not be another opportunity to get one for a really, really long time. And if that's the case, if there just takes a couple of people to want that card that is rare, when something is rare, it completely changes the angle of the supply and demand curves on the chart. It completely changes it. A very, very slight change in the demand for a low supply card, a severely low supply card, changes the price dramatically. So when you start talking about pre-war cards, again, there are a lot of, 33 Gaudi Lou Gehrig's, but there aren't a lot of 33 Lou Gehrig's in high grade. So whatever the last one sold for, if you find one in a 6, you got to pony up the money because there may not be one for a really long time. So there is no doubt about it that one of the biggest factors when determining whether to pay any attention to the comp is how rare is the card. If you're looking at a very rare card, sometimes you just gotta kind of have to pay the asking price, assuming that the asking price is somewhere within reason. My buddy Orlando of A Collector's Dream, for years he was collecting pretty much any Goodwin Champions card he could find. If he found one and it was nice looking, he pretty much bought it. And he would just say it's hard to comp those because they come up so rarely. And a lot of the ones that dealers would show him were the comps were cards he had bought because he was the only one that had bought the last one. And so as long as the price isn't insane, sometimes you just got to pay it, or else your opportunity, which may not come up for a while, might pass you by.
Another thing that sometimes matters is what the seller actually paid. My friend Don says, another stellar video. This is an incredibly deep question worthy of a discussion with the best panel you can put together. Graded cards give you a starting point. If raw, it's up to your grading skills. Population and rarity need to factor in. I always pay attention to what dealers price a card or set at and what somebody tells me they paid for cards. This gives me a general idea of what values are close. Then it comes down to your negotiation skills and knowledge. Everyone wants a deal, but is holding firm to your price worth losing the opportunity? If it's a card that seems to be available regularly, then yes, you can move on. But if it's a card that rarely, if ever, comes up, I don't think you can overpay if pricing is fair and not ridiculous to your budget. In that case, you may just have to set the market. From a dealer perspective, in a falling market, I doubt he would be willing to sell at a loss. That might be the stone wall you're up against. This whole question is much bigger than one comment can answer. I look forward to hearing a discussion on this topic. Thanks.
All right. I think this is a great response from my buddy Don, and he touches on several different things, including, again, if it's a rare card, sometimes you just got to step up and pay the price as long as it's not crazy, and as long as it's not crazy going to blow your budget. And he makes, I think it's a really good point. And he also talks about what the dealer paid. Now, a lot of dealers, for whatever reason, and I don't personally really agree with this line of thinking, but a lot of dealers are like, oh no, I paid more than that. I have too much into that card. I mean, this is a true story. I was literally, probably 15 years ago, I went into my local card shop. There's a restaurant that we love that's like right next door to the local card shop. And so we were in town. I don't live in the town I grew up in anymore, but we were in town and we went out to eat. And when we went out to eat, we're like, hey, let's hop into the card shop for old time's sake. And it's still there. And this is one of the local card shops that was in town, but this one still exists. And we walked in and it was like a time capsule. He had one of his cases, and it was like all the cards that were there from 20 years earlier. And one of the cards that was in it was an 86 Donruss Jose Canseco rated rookie card. And he had like $60 on it. And it wasn't like gem mint. It wasn't perfect. And we're like, hey, what do you want for the Canseco? Like, what would you take? Your price is like $60. And he's like, well, yeah, I can't go under 60 because that's what I paid for it. And we're like, I mean, this is in like maybe 2005. And he's like, oh yeah, I bought that card in 1988 and I paid $60 for it. So I got to get at least $60 for it. I'm like, is there a hidden camera in here? This dude has this card 20 years later at the time, and he doesn't want to sell it for less than he paid for it 20 years ago. Like, at some point, don't you want to clear some of your inventory? But there are dealers that think that way. So it's sort of like before you go to buy a new car, like just a little tip if you weren't aware of it. Before you go to buy a new car at the car dealership, look up the invoice price on the car. Look up what the dealer paid for the car. If the car, the dealer paid $32,000 and the sticker on it is $42,000, you know you've got $10,000 of margin in there, right? They're not going to sell it for $32,000 because you have to make a little bit of money. They got to pay some people and all that kind of stuff. But you know that at $32,000 for the car they're asking $42,000, you know that it's going to be somewhere in there. So if a dealer does tip his hand and he says, oh, you know, I paid $1,200 for that card and he's got $1,500 on it, he might take $1,300. He might take $1,300. And some will not go under that amount, which again, to me, I don't necessarily think makes a lot of sense at times. But I think Don makes a good point that sometimes listening to those details and thinking from their perspective makes a little bit of sense. Sometimes when a dealer gets a really good deal on a buy, like they buy $1,000 card for $500, they're probably going to be much more willing to let it go for $800 than if they bought it for $800. They might sell it for under market value when they got a killer deal on it. So I think that's a good point, and I think it's something as a negotiation tactic to at least consider and keep your ear out for if they slip up and share some of that information.
The final thing to think about is maybe it's just complicated. This final comment says, "Great video, Greg. I love hearing people's stories. As for next week's question, this reminds me of your buy the card, not the grade debate. The grade is just an opinion. Everyone wants technology to do the work for them. You can look up comps in any price guide app or website you like. Comps are just a baseline price. Hopefully they have pictures to compare. You have to use your experience in the hobby to make a judgment. Is the player overpriced in your opinion? Are you willing to pay more because you think the color and clarity is amazing? Do you pay less because the centering isn't perfect? What's important to you? Technology can only give you an opinion. Use your eyes, your mind, and your own taste in what's important."
I really like this last comment, and I think it kind of wraps up the whole thing. It's not as simple as it seems. At least it's not to me. You know, we say, well, yeah, just kind of look at the grade. You know, if it's a PSA, what does a PSA 7 sell for? And if it's really well centered, it might be a little higher. And if it's a little off center, it might be a little bit lower. And I personally think there are so many factors that play into it. And sort of like the housing example from earlier, you know, it's like two similar houses in a similar neighborhood, but one of them might have a completely renovated kitchen and living room and bathrooms and a new roof and a new landscaping. And the other one might be the original owner who hasn't done anything to it in 30 years. And that is kind of the case to me. And there are so many factors that I don't think and that comment was, yeah, you can comp two comparable things that are similar but different. I think that there are so many factors that there are times that you kind of can't. There are times, if it's a rare card, if it's a really high eye appeal card, it's a really well-centered card, I think people need to not be afraid to step out of being kind of attached or tethered to what the recent comps are. Because a lot of those recent comps are nowhere near what it's going to sell for. And if it does, then you got an absolutely crazy deal. It's a complicated topic. And if somebody could make a really strong argument that comps don't matter at all. And I think someone can make a really strong argument that they still should. There's just some people with a lot of money that are willing to pay way above whatever the comp is. And I think that it could be a pretty interesting argument. And I think we heard some of each side in this discussion today. For me, my takeaway and my suggestion to a lot of you is it might be a guide that what the recent sales are, but I think we're moving in a direction where eye appeal has such a premium, where centering seems to be such a premium, where when you're looking at vintage cards at least, and again, we're talking mostly vintage here because like Dad's comment said, side by side, a lot of modern cards look very, very, very similar. That when you're comparing two vintage cards, the number of factors and the differences between some of the cards, I really think it's important to give yourself permission to step up from whatever that recent series of comps are. Because if it's rare and it's got high eye appeal and it's well centered, I think it's going to sell for quite a bit more at auction, as long as it gets the eyes on it, than what the similar grades have been. And the more that we do this, the more that the spread from a high to a low price on a common grade is, the more that if a 7 sells from anywhere from 100 to 250, the wider the spread, the wider the margin, the wider the percentage at which a card sells for, from the low end to the high end, the more we're taking the power back as the hobbyist, as the collector. Because if every single 8 sells for the exact same amount, we're giving so much power to the grading company. And the only way to take the power back is to give yourself permission to go, you know what? I know it's a 3, but it's not a good looking 3. So I'm not going to pay your regular 3 price. And that might require some patience. It might require some patience. And at the end of the day, the grade, again, should not be the law. The grade is an opinion of a single person on a single day. And remember what the president of PSA said. Let's just remind ourselves of that. Yeah, guys, again, it's a card could be a 7 one day, an 8 the next, a 6 the next. It could be an 8 today and a 9 tomorrow and a 7 the next day. So if you are relying on just what the card is selling for in that number, then you're kind of forgetting about what the actual card looks like instead of only what the grade looks like. For this week's question, one of the things that I've seen circulating around a lot is all these thumbnails saying, is the hobby dying? Is card collecting dying? You know, a buddy who lives up in Canada and watches a channel, my pal Golden Slumber, he sent me a link to an article or a video. It was a video that talked about how Fanatics' credit rating just dropped. Is the hobby in trouble? I don't know. I don't want to taint the jury pool, but that's been something that people have been talking about. So my question is to all of you in Midlife Nation, is the hobby dying? And to kind of coincide with what John Mangini's been asking people to say, and he said, make a video, tell me what should be done to improve the hobby, to improve card collecting. Well, a lot of us don't have a channel. Let's use this platform as your opportunity to share your ideas on what needs to be done. So is the hobby dying? And what can we do to improve it? Save it? Or just make it better? Share your thoughts. I look forward to sharing all of those ideas next week.